Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that was chosen this month is the weirdest rulings I've ever issued. Over a decade of judging, there's definitely some interesting ones here, so let's get started. Okay, for the first one, Amy had a gigantic mutate stack with 4 creatures on top of a Brazella, Voice of Nightmares, which entered the battlefield as a copy of Voice of the Wild. And then Nick played a Humility, and then, of course, this didn't actually happen. I think a lot of people have an idea that the weirdest question I've ever answered would be something like this. Unfortunately, this is one of those cases where the answer is not the coolest thing that it could possibly be. See, most judging takes place in the context of a Magic tournament. Now, how many people do you think are playing cards like this in a tournament environment? After I explain this to people, the next thing that I hear is, well, yeah, but what about EDH? And surely wacky stuff happens all the time in EDH, right? Well, in CDH, the answer is no, because players who are trying to win do not play cards like that. In regular EDH, they do, but the actual answer to almost any question like that is, I could figure it out, but I would have to do several minutes or hours of research. In a kitchen table game, that's everyone's cue to just agree to what seems right and roll with it. As long as I'm disappointing people and crushing dreams, I can tell you that I do also get a lot of questions like this submitted to me via email or the suggestion form that's in the description for my videos. Anytime I see the word mutate on that form, I literally stop reading and go to the next question. There's a few other red flags that lead to the same response, the most common of which is requiring multiple paragraphs of setup before you can get to the actual question in. Again, I hate being the fun police here, but I also like to be transparent and set realistic expectations. The fact is, I'm not spending my time answering a question like that unless I'm getting paid for it. One of the reasons that I include CR citations in my episodes and focus so much on education is because if you're capable of doing research and figuring out an answer on your own, you don't need to convince someone else that your question is interesting in order to get an answer for it. Okay, well, instead of complaining about that, maybe I can give people what they're actually interested in. And I think there actually are some real winners in here. First call that comes to mind when I think of the weirdest judge calls of my career happened at a Modern event shortly after Amonkhet was released. Amy had a Gideon of the Trials and had used its bottom ability to get an emblem. Nick was on Lantern control and he had managed to mill Amy out. Amy then went to her draw step with an empty library and Nick said that he should win the game. Amy said that she got to keep playing because she had Gideon and the Gideon emblem. So the players called a judge. How would you rule here? Well, when I took this call, my first thought was I have to be missing something. So I repeated back what I heard to the players. Amy has the emblem? Yep. And the Gideon? Yep. And so you think she should lose the game? Yep. As an educator, my skill in explanations is a point of pride for me. And fundamental to a good explanation is being able to understand what part of the interaction the player isn't getting, so you can base the explanation around clarifying that part. But this one had me stumped. Sometimes cases like this can be caused by a language barrier, but this guy definitely sounded like a native English speaker. Sometimes people get salty when they feel like they should have won, so they look for any way that they can to get that result. But this guy seemed like he genuinely thought there was something special about getting milled out that made it so Gideon's emblem wouldn't save Amy. I felt like I was in that meme where Patrick dropped his wallet, so I ruled that Amy did not in fact lose the game, and then Nick appealed the ruling. So if you don't know, big events usually have a hierarchical structure for judges, where there's one or more head judges with multiple floor judges working underneath them. If a floor judge issues a ruling that a player disagrees with, they can appeal that ruling to have it heard by a head judge. Sometimes players feel bad about doing this, like they're saying they don't trust the floor judge and can I speak to your manager? But I don't begrudge anyone if they exercise their right to appeal. Sometimes judges do make mistakes, and a good judge would rather take a little bit of extra time and face a little bit of embarrassment in the short term if it meant the players would get the best ruling possible. Even if the original ruling is correct, there's still value in an appeal if having a second opinion can increase a player's confidence in the ruling. If you'd like to hear more about appeals and the mechanics and etiquette behind them, check out my video titled, What Happens When You Disagree with a Judge. Alright, so the player appealed the ruling, and I found the head judge, and I told him, hey, I have an appeal, here's what happened. Then he asked me if I was trolling him, and I said I wasn't, and so he followed me over to the match, where, after carefully checking to make sure I hadn't missed anything, the head judge upheld my ruling and had the players continue the gameplay. To this day, I'm still not sure what happened with that call, but at least I am confident that I delivered the correct ruling there. The next call is going to require a little bit of background. This is going to make me feel a little bit old having to explain all this, but oh well. See, Back in the days before Companion, there were slips of paper that judges handed out at the beginning of the match. Now, this is how the players reported their results of their matches in the days before they could do it in an app on their phones. Magic's scorekeepers were responsible for reading the results slips and inputting that information into their computer. Events with hundreds or thousands of players would thus have hundreds or even thousands of result slips that needed to be entered accurately every round. In those days, the best scorekeepers were prized not just for their data entry skills and their ability to cope with this stressful responsibility, but also for their background in dealing with the notoriously temperamental software that events were run on at the time, which sometimes needed to be massaged in a specific arcane way to coax it to do its job properly. The other important fact that we'll need for this story is that in those days, players used a unique identifying number rather than their companion accounts to register for a tournament. This DCI number was required for entry, and it was a common sight to see scorekeepers helping players look theirs up prior to the start of an event. If you didn't have one, they would have you fill out a form and get one set up. Now that we have that background information set, let's put it together to tell the story. It was near the end of the round, so I was doing what judges customarily did at that time, patrolling the floor to collect up result slips. Since the tournament couldn't proceed until all of them were turned in, judges often swept for slips at the end of each round so that the players could stay and chat after their matches were finished without delaying the event. I approached one match and asked if they were finished, offering to take their slip up. They were, but one player hadn't signed the results slip. I pointed this out and asked him to sign, but one of that player's friends was watching this unfold, and clearly joking around with his friend, he moved the results slip out of the way while his friend was signing it. Unfortunately, this caused the slip to tear, and not all the way in two, but definitely enough to be noticeable. And in my judgment, definitely enough to be considered behavior that was disruptive to the tournament. Yes, that's right. This spectator had committed unsporting conduct. Now, right out of the gate, that's enough to get on the board for weird calls. Unsporting conduct isn't a penalty that comes up all that often, but it gets even better. Turns out this guy was actually not even playing in that event. He just came by to see how his friend was doing. The official protocol for situations like this was to enter the player into that event so that the penalty could be given. He wouldn't be getting paired or actually be part of the standings or anything, but his name would appear in the tournament record, and it would show that he had committed an unsporting conduct minor during that event. Okay, so I let the player know about this, and he said he actually did not have a DCI number. Now, I'm pretty confident this was a lie. Remember, he would have been asked for his DCI number to participate in any Magic event at that weekend. So unless this guy was a non-Magic player who just so happened to come by the convention center to check what all the hubbub was about with his Magic playing friends, this story was BS. I could have called him out on this, but I didn't because my goal was to disincentivize this guy from horsing around, not to prove how big time I, the mighty judge, was and get him kicked out of an event for a joke that had some unintended consequences. On top of that, his friends had backed up this story, so calling out this lie would have probably had some negative consequences for them too. There was also the fact that this happened near the end of the round, so starting a crusade here would have likely required doing some investigations that could have resulted in delaying the whole event for everybody, which I thought was definitely not worth it. So yeah, I ended up taking this guy's word for it that he didn't have a DCI number, but that doesn't mean he didn't win any stupid prizes for playing stupid games. I informed him that there was no problem with that, and he would just need to come with me to the scorekeeper's table for a minute. At which point, I got one of those DCI registration forms and had him fill it out. While he was working on that, I let the scorekeeper know that I'd unlocked a judge achievement, making a player get a DCI number so that they could be entered into an event to receive a penalty. Officially, I think the actual achievement would be if the penalty was a disqualification, which could, hypothetically happen if you caught someone stealing a table number or something at an event, but I'm giving myself partial credit at least here since I'm unaware of any confirmed reports of a judge ever actually getting that crown jewel of an accomplishment. I actually think that as weird as that call was, it ended up going pretty well, but I'm not sure if this was the best way to handle it even years later. Let me know in the comments if you like or didn't like what I did. Remember, my goal was to give this guy a break, but not in a way that encouraged him or his friends to try to get away with stuff at future events. For the final story, I was on the deck checks team at an event, and in case you're not familiar with that, at competitive rel events, all the players have to turn in a deck list before round one that says what cards they're playing in their main deck and sideboard. This is to make sure players don't change what cards that they're playing over the course of the tournament, and to keep people from preemptively sideboarding cards in for game one if they somehow manage to figure out what their opponent is on before the gameplay starts. As the name suggests, the deck checks team is responsible for maintaining custody of the deck lists players have turned in, and checking some fraction of the players' decks against their deck lists during that event. So during a deck check, I found a very interesting error. The deck contained 3 copies of Fleshbag Marauder, whereas the deck list that the player turned in did not have any copies of that card registered. Rather, it said that the player should have 3 copies of Merciless Executioner. Now, before I go on, maybe pause the video or at least think about what you think the correct infraction penalty and fix should be for a case like this. For now, we'll assume that it was an honest mistake. You'll see why later. Ready? Okay, so normally the way that this would shake out would probably involve giving a game loss to the infracting player due to the discrepancy between what the deck list said that they were playing and what they actually were. There might be some wiggle room if you intended to play the card that was listed on your deck list and you accidentally didn't for some reason, but yeah, normally I would expect to give this player a game loss. But attentive viewers might have guessed there was something more going on here, and that's indeed correct. I said that this was an interesting error, but so far everything I've explained is pretty much by the book. Well, take a look at the cards in question. They're functionally identical, except that one is a zombie warrior while the other is an orc warrior, a difference that no deck in Standard would reasonably care about. Both cards were in Standard at the same time though, and by the letter of the law, this was looking like a game loss. I did the objectively correct thing and called the head judge to ask his opinion. We talked with the player, who confirmed what we had already suspected. The discrepancy was due to an availability issue. He had filled out his deck list beforehand, copying it from what he had played in his testing online, and then he picked up the Fleshbag Marauders from a vendor on site, and he didn't even realize that it was actually a different card. The head judge agreed with me that rules as written, this should be a game loss, but rules as intended, there was no way that the penalty was appropriate. This player could not have gained any advantage from his mistake. His list did not have both creatures. He wasn't even playing the full 4. There was no plausible chance of the creature type mattering, etc. The head judge downgraded this penalty to a warning and advised the player that a meaner head judge might not do the same thing if this situation were to come up in the future. And that's 3 of the weirdest calls in my judging career. I hope these stories were as interesting to you as they were to me, especially at the time. Thank you once again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon, and that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another Daily Ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.